Hi everyone, today we're going to start talking about Vietnam. This week I'd like for you to do sections 1, 2, and 3. So listen to the lectures, take the video quizzes, and then also the quiz over the sections. Next week we'll do section 4. I will do a Kahoot and Quizlet, and then there will be a test. So that's how we're going to progress. Okay, so I want to talk about the background to the conflict. This is section 1 of chapter 33. Let's get going. Okay, so first off, you need to know where Vietnam is. Vietnam is located in Southeast Asia. Right here, it's this very long, skinny country right there. So it's just south of China. It's also there in the South China Sea. So keep that in mind as we go forward because it's important. All right, you can see here's a better image of it. It is the eastern and southernmost country in Southeast Asia. It's got a really odd shape, right? It's 130,000 square miles. It's very mountainous, as you're going to see, with dense tropical forests. To the north, up here is China, right? And then over here you have Laos. It shares a border with Laos, and then Cambodia. And then all along the coast here is the Gulf of Tonkin, right? So that's the Gulf of Tonkin there. There are some very dense population centers, especially down here. I want you to look at this river. This is the Mekong River, which flows through here, and this is the delta where it comes out. So that's the Mekong Delta. There used to be Saigon down here. They now call it Ho Chi Minh City. So it's important to sort of orient yourself to the map so that you know what we're talking about as we go through this. Well, here's a topographical map of Vietnam. So down here where the Mekong Delta is, it's lowlands, right? And you have some lowlands up here around Hanoi as well. And then that right there, I believe that's the Red River that flows there. But notice these mountains all along its border right here. There's some very high mountains in this area. They also have a very narrow coastal plain with some great beaches along there. Right, but the mountains are going to be problematic for our soldiers when they go over there and they have to fight a war in this very hot and humid climate. Okay, here, doesn't that look exotic? Look at the mountains that just jump right out of the ocean. This is obviously from tectonic activity that takes place. Notice too, it's very green and lush because it's in a tropical environment, but that also means it's very hot. Okay, and these are rice paddies where it's very flat. And then you look at those mountains right there. Now, these mountains were used against the United States because what the Vietnamese did is they tunneled in there and they would have huge headquarters. You know, hundreds and hundreds of men would be located inside these tunnels in these mountains, and it was very difficult to find them. This occurred with the French and then with the United States as well. Okay, here's an image too of it during the day. Just very lush, tropical, like I said, very exotic looking. It's important to note that these jungles are very dense. Our guys are going to be tasked to go over there and hunt for the enemy and kill them. But they have to, it's like finding a needle in the haystack. They have to try to draw their fire in these forests, and it's really difficult. They don't know the forest, they don't know the terrain, the vegetation, and that sort of thing. So it was terrible for them. And then you also have these very dense population centers. This is a more recent picture, but you can see how crowded it is, right? Something that many Americans, especially back then, were not accustomed to. And then, too, you didn't know who your enemy was because it's not like they're fighting these armed combatants, these uniformed combatants. They are armed, excuse me, but not uniformed. They don't have a uniform on. So oftentimes, you don't know who your enemy is. So that was a problem as well. Okay, so let's look a little bit at Vietnamese history. This is important because the Vietnamese, all they've ever really wanted was their independence, but throughout their history, they were occupied by many different kingdoms and world powers. So if you go back as far as 200 BC, they were occupied by China, right? China went down there because in Vietnam they have a longer growing season. They have more fertile soil. So they went down there for that. So they stayed there for about 700 years, and then they get this period of independence. Oh gosh, more than that. So like for 1,000 years, China is there. But then they do get a period of independence, and this was because guerrilla warfare was fought against them. The person who led the charge against the Chinese was pictured right here, Lê Loi. He's kind of known like Vietnam's George Washington, right? What they did was they used guerrilla warfare to fight against the Chinese. This is important because they're skilled at that. They're going to use it against the French. They're going to use it against the Japanese, and they're going to use it against the United States, right? But they used this to expel the Chinese, and they had a period of maybe 500 years where they were independent. Lê Loi was the emperor, and then others followed. Then there's this period of revived colonialism in the latter part of the 1800s. All these different nations are looking for coaling stations and natural resources, coaling stations for their ships so they can go and recoal the ships that were run on that during that time. They're also looking for natural resources and markets for their finished goods. So the French go into this area right here. They combine Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and they make it French Indochina at that period, right? So they create a kingdom of their own. They also have colonies in other parts of Asia and in Africa. Okay, so then there's this independence movement that takes place against the French. The person who leads that is a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh. He was appealing to the United States as early as Woodrow Wilson's administration in about 1916 for assistance to expel the French. He believed, and rightly so, that the United States stood for independence. We opposed a colonial power in England. The only thing is that we kind of had we did have a xenophobic view that the French were more our allies than the Vietnamese because they were European. Also, Ho Chi Minh had communist leanings. Now, the Communist Revolution happened in Russia in 1917, and it appealed to many people throughout the world, especially those under the oppressive governments of imperial powers. So Ho Chi Minh, who is a Buddhist, his name was Ngo Tak Thong, but people call him Ho Chi Minh, which means he who enlightens. So he's like a teacher, he enlightens people. He was a world wanderer. He had gone to China, he had gone to the USSR, he had even been in the United States. But communism and socialism appealed to him. Most people in Vietnam lived as peasants, and he thought that communism would be good or for the people of Vietnam, right? So he organizes that resistance, as I said, against first the French, then the Japanese, then the French, and then the United States. And now we're going to see how all of that played out. Okay, here's some other pictures of Ho Chi Minh. This one right here is interesting because Ho Chi Minh is on the right, and a man by the name of Ngo Diem Diem, as we're going to call him, he was kind of like the hand-picked leader of South Vietnam under the French and then also under the United States, and he's going to end up getting assassinated. This is a sort of a depiction, a statue of Ho Chi Minh. He's idolized. He's seen as a hero for the people of Vietnam. And if you don't believe me, look at this. This is his casket, and that is him. It's much like Vladimir Lenin's. Lenin's is still up at Red Square, and every year they take his body out and they bathe it in embalming fluid, and they put it in this climate controlled environment casket where people can come out and still view the body. So that's kind of the case with Ho Chi Minh as well. Kind of creepy. All right, so let's look at some history. This map right here, this shows you at different time periods how the Japanese had expanded in Asia. First they're in Japan, then they're in Manchuria where it's pink, and then mainland China where it's yellow, and they just kept expanding throughout Asia. Then they go down into the area where it's purple, They kicked the French out of French Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And the Philippines, that was an American territory. They kicked the Americans out of there. So during World War II, Japan had control of this vast territory in Asia and parts of the Pacific as well. They're going to be defeated, though. They'll surrender in World War II after the United States attacks them, first at Hiroshima and then at Nagasaki. They're going to surrender in September of 1945. You see here, they already started to withdraw in August. Okay, so Vietnam is happy. They're thinking, we got rid of the French, now we got rid of the Japanese, we have our independence. And Ho Chi Minh comes out on September 2nd, 1945. He gives this speech in front of like 500,000 cheering Vietnamese people thinking that they have their independence. He even quotes the Declaration of Independence, right? Because he equates their independence to the independence of the United States against England. And they're seeking our support, believing that we are allies in this independence movement. Okay, so after World War II, France comes back into Vietnam and reoccupies the territory, believing that it's back to normal. There were some low-level insurgencies that happened, but initially there wasn't much of a warfare, right? Ho Chi Minh pleads to the United States for assistance, but Truman ignored his pleas and instead supports France. This was a time where right after World War II, we enter into the Cold War, right? We've talked about this before. And it was the belief that if one Asian country fell to communism, then they're all going to fall. And then there will be worldwide domination by the communists, right? So instead of supporting the Vietnamese, we supported the French financially and with supplies, right? So then an all-out war breaks out between the Vietnamese and the French, and it becomes a proxy war. And by a proxy war, what I mean is that the United States is supplying the French with money and weapons and that sort of thing. The Soviet Union and China is supplying Viet Minh. The Viet Minh are the North Vietnamese fighters organized under Ho Chi Minh to fight for independence. So they're fighting them at this time. Once Truman leaves office and Eisenhower comes in, he continues the same policy. All right, then the French, they're fighting all of this, but they get themselves into a bind. They go into this valley up here, Dien Bien Phu. So you can see this up here in North Vietnam. Okay, so that reminds me of we didn't start the fire, right? Dien Bien Phu Falls, rock around the clock. But anyway, so they're up there in Dien Bien Phu. They were thinking that they were going to draw the Vietnamese to them and then they were going to defeat them. The only thing is they drew the Vietnamese to them and the Vietnamese defeated them. So the French are forced to surrender, and they do this in May of 1954. Now keep in mind, at this time, there had already been the Communist Revolution in China, and there had already been, too, the Korean War, right? So both of those had fallen, North Korea had fallen to communism. All right, so all of the players meet at Geneva. Geneva was the site of the League of Nations in Switzerland, right? So France shows up, as does Vietnam, right? Laos and Cambodia, the parts of French Indochina. But then also the USSR, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Now, these are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, right? China, the USSR, England, France, and the US. So they're all there, plus Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the USSR and China are pitted kind of against, so it's east against west in this international conflict. So anyway, they go to discuss the future of Vietnam, right? The Chinese are aiding the Viet Minh. They had been doing that since 1950, right? And they wanted to try to get rid of U.S. influence in the region, right? They didn't want a strong Vietnamese government. So here are the terms that the United States did not agree to. We didn't like this. First of all, there was a ceasefire. We liked that. There really wasn't a political settlement, though. and Vietnam would be divided along the 17th parallel. That sounds familiar, right? In Korea, it was at the 38th parallel. There are going to be elections that were going to be in 1956. So this is why the U.S. didn't support them. We, a Democratic people, did not want the elections. And the reason we didn't want them is we were fearful that the communists would be victorious, right? So we didn't support it. Okay, so here's what it looks like after the Geneva Convention. Vietnam is going to be divided at the 17th parallel. So this is, I'm trying to write it up here. There we go. This is where the 17th parallel is. Sorry about that. My mouse didn't see it. And so there's northern Vietnam, right? And that's the Democratic Republic of North Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh's in charge there. When that happened, you get this mass exodus of people fleeing the north and going to the south. So it's my notion or my belief that maybe had they just had these free elections, maybe Ho Chi Minh wouldn't have won because all those people are leaving. They didn't want to live under communism, right? So in the South, the ruler is going to be a guy by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem, right? He's the one I was showing you in the picture with Ho Chi Minh. So you got Ho Chi Minh in the north under communism, and Ngo Dinh Diem, who is kind of a puppet leader, or what the United States believes is a puppet leader, in the South. Okay, so here is Ngo Dinh Diem meeting with President Eisenhower, right? He had been a government official under the French. The French didn't really think much of him, but we liked him because he was opposed to communism and he was pro-American, right? And he became the president of this newly established Republic of Vietnam. The only thing is he's very corrupt. Not just him, but he has this whole big corrupt family that is as well. His brother is kind of like his right-hand man, and his wife was just horrible, right? He refused to have the elections that were called for in 1956. Among his people, he's extremely unpopular. One reason is because he's a Catholic in a nation where most of the people are devout Buddhist. And it's not just that he's Catholic, it's just that he was suppressing Buddhists. He wouldn't allow them their religious freedom, right? He would also beat, imprison, or kill political opponents of his. And so there were more and more people who were rising up against him, and we continued to support this guy. We just didn't understand it, right? So this revolution began in the 1950s, and they were to get rid of Diem, and they were aided by the North, even though the people in the South weren't necessarily communists. They just didn't like Diem. Right? So this group of people, that's the National Liberation Front, right? Their goal was to overthrow Diem. They were called the Viet Cong. They were Vietnamese communists, even though most of them really weren't communists. They just wanted to get rid of Diem, but they were called this. So anyway, you didn't really know who they were. They were undetectable, and they hid. They would do these guerrilla attacks and then flee and hide, and they'd go into caves like this one here. Those are still around today, and some people who go and do historical tourism go and tour them. All right, so the United States continues its involvement. Remember, under Truman and under Eisenhower, it was just giving them aid and equipment. But under Kennedy, Kennedy looked weak after the Bay of Pigs, right, and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin Wall, and so he doesn't want to look weak. So the one thing remember, he had that flexible response. He wanted a lot of different options in dealing with the Cold War. So what he did is he sent advisors there. By 1960, there were 900 advisors, and before Kennedy died, he'd said, okay, we want another 16,000. And he had allowed them to take direct military action against the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh in Vietnam, right? They were supposed to be aided by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, even though they were not very trustworthy. And these guys really didn't want to fight either. And Diem's army kind of thought, well, we're just going to let them fight. We're not going to do that. So anyway, by the time that Kennedy had died in 1963, there were already 500 U.S. service members who had given their lives in Vietnam. All right, then the protests against Diem really heat up. I shouldn't have said that. the Buddhists start to protest in the streets, and then one of them goes and sets himself on fire. He sits down very calmly. Another Buddhist monk helps him to douse himself with gasoline, and then he just burns. The weird thing is that every part of him turned to ashes except for his heart, and they tried several times to burn it. So all of the people, they were even more compelled them to protest against Diem. So Henry Cabot Lodge, a great negotiator from the United States, was sent to Vietnam to negotiate with Diem for him to stop these repressive measures, right? But he refused. He wouldn't even discuss the issues. So Kennedy kind of gives the go-ahead to get rid of Diem. And so Diem was assassinated, and this guy by the name of Nguyen Thanh Phu became the new president of South Vietnam. And he would continue to be throughout the rest of the time that the United States is in Vietnam, even up to and including Richard Nixon's administration.